from here. Thanks so much, Broker Hayes. Some of your contracts are going to include some different variations based on what you might have added to the transaction. But for the most part, there are some general milestones and common tasks that you need to be sure to hit as you move from contract to closing. All right. So this is also a discussion about managing the timelines, right? So again, what you've agreed to is buyer will make their escrow deposit within 3 days. Inspection will be conducted within 7 days. Loan application will be made within 5 days. Loan approval will be within 21 days. Okay, we have all these dates in our head. How are we effectively managing these timelines and these deadlines from the contract to close process? We're going to talk about that. And then finally, we're going to talk about some of the common missteps. It could be from forgetting about a date. It could be misunderstanding of the concepts or the requirements or the responsibilities. But there are some common missteps that we see as you go from the contract to closing process that we want to make sure to touch on in today's discussion. Now, at the end of our discussion today, I assure you that you will have a comprehensive understanding of how to effectively manage the execution of agreed upon contract terms. This is all you're doing. You've already agreed to specific terms. You've already agreed to handle specific items. Now let's talk about how you ensure that those are executed. And then we're also going to send, we have a timeline abstract tool that we use to track critical tasks and deadlines. Some people are still paper and pencil. That's fine. If you have a transaction coordinator or you're using dot loop or one of those electronic date tracking systems, that's great as well. But we're going to send to you a timeline abstract tool, say that fast 3 times, timeline abstract tool that you can utilize to manage your dates and timelines. And then finally, you're going to be aware of the common missteps that compromise a successful transaction. We're going to have this conversation. So some landmines, I guess I should say, or things that you should look out for in managing the transaction. So a couple of background points to make. With regards to execution of the contract, you want to ensure that the contract is fully executed with all pages initialed and signed. All pages initialed and signed, right? So yes, can a contract be enforceable without an initial on a particular page? Of course it can, especially specifically if it's signed at the end. However, the reason why pages are initialed at the bottom is such that if there is a dispute, the signor, if they've initialed, you can point and say, well, isn't this your initial at the bottom of the page? And if they say yes, you say, well, we have to assume that you've read this term and that you've agreed to this term. Your signature is at the bottom of the page, right? Finally, you want to ensure that all pages and riders are included in delivery to the parties. Riders specifically, especially if your transaction involves a property that's located in a condo association or a homeowners association, because you guys know that those riders carry their own timelines for execution of the contract, right? Those riders say that the buyer can, within X number of days, cancel the contract based on the information that they received in the disclosure. Right? We're going to talk about this a little bit later on in our time together, but in the HOA rider, in that rider, you disclose the monthly association dues. And let's say you have a challenging buyer who's already been looking for a reason to get out of the contract, and at the 11th hour, you deliver to them the rider that says that they must pay $10 per month in association dues, and they figured out that they can cancel within X number of days of receipt of that rider. They figured out that they can cancel, and they say, you know what? I'm not paying $10 per month. I am canceling the contract. Guess what? That's their right. This is why make sure all pages and riders, pages and riders are included in the delivery to all parties. And then finally, you want to make sure that there are no conflicting terms. That's a very broad statement. Here are some of the things I tell you that you should consider when you say no conflicting terms. Of course, certain sections of the contract provide 3 different options, right? Is the contract assignable? Who's selecting the title agent and paying for policy? Who's paying for special assessments? Those sections of the contract have an area for you to check one of the boxes. Check one box. not three, not two out of the three. Check one box. Otherwise, that is what's considered a conflicting term. So with regards to managing the timelines, here's some of the high level dates that you need to ensure that you're tracking. Again, whether you're on the buyer side or the seller side, it's important for both sides to be on top of these dates. The first one generally comes up to the escrow deposit. Make sure that the escrow deposit is made. Then the inspection deadline, the loan application and approval deadline, the appraisal deadline, if there is one. You know that the contract currently does not have a deadline for an appraisal to be completed built into it. However, some savvy agents, listing agents, will include an addendum to say that the appraisal must be conducted within X number of days. Why do they do this? Because they want to know sooner than later whether or not there's going to be an issue with the appraisal. You don't want to get down the road, 21 days, and now they're saying, oh, the property didn't appraise. So if that is one of your deadlines, you want to make sure that that is scheduled and it is checked for at the appropriate time. Association application and approval. Remember, we talked about that. If the property is in an association, you want to make sure that the application is made within the agreed upon time. The HOA writer does have a deadline, if it's filled in properly, for the association application to be made, as well as for the approval to be received. Finally, title commitment to the buyer. The contract does provide for a deadline for the title commitment to be delivered to the buyer. That is a seller's obligation. It's obviously facilitated by the title agent, but that is something that's in the contract. That is a date that's within the contract. The survey, there is a deadline by which time by which the survey needs to be conducted. And if there's any objection to the survey, the buyer must make those objections known. And then obviously there's a final walkthrough. What's the deadline for that? I would think it's right before closing. That's built in. And then your closing date. So these are all your different timelines that you're tracking and you're ensuring that are hit, and you're in that very short contract to close timeline. And I say very short because generally we're looking at 30 days, but in this market, if you're trying to be aggressive, some contracts are coming in at 21 days. We can make it happen, but you got a lot of work to do within those 21 days, especially if it's a finance transaction, right? So since a large part of what we're doing in the contract to close process is managing timelines, you want to be sure that you are using the appropriate measure to compute your time periods. Not every agent is lenient, and it'll give you that grace period to know that you missed the deadline by a day. So with that being said, most times we use the FAR as is residential contract for purchase and sale. And we know that in the FAR as is contract, that dates are calculated using calendar days, right? What does that mean? That means that you count every day from start period to end date. Calendar days. We know that if you utilize the standard, not the as is, if you use the standard residential contract, what's usually called the CRISP, we know that time periods are calculated using business days. What do you think? We have a question from Ruth. What do you think about putting the closing date on or before July 4th? That's a good question. You would, if in one of the contract class, I always say put a date. Do not include the language on or before, because that can be left up to interpretation and it's unclear. And believe it or not, you've had situations where the buyer was ready before July 30th. The seller was not. Now we're having a conversation because the language clearly says on or before. Are we doing on or before or not? So you should just put the date. And I always say it's better if you decide to close sooner, you can do that later. Okay, that's a very good question. So the effective date is the starting point for calculation of time periods. Assuming we're using the FAR as is, again, because that's what we get. I haven't gotten a CRISP in a couple of years now. So if you've taken the contract class before with me, you know that the FAR as is essentially, it's a template contract that's written from the standpoint that the buyer is going to purchase the property as is. No repairs are being made by the seller. versus the crisp, it starts from a point of the seller will make repairs up to X amount of dollars. Okay. And we know that the FAR bar as is, we use measuring is the calendar days. And we know from definition that the effective date, make sure we let this person in, that the effective date of the contract, this is important. This is an important point that you cannot miss this. The effective date of the contract is the date when the last of the buyer and seller has signed or initialed the purchase contract and delivered the final version of the contract to the other party. This is important. It's sign and deliver, not just sign. Today is July 6th. If I sign, if I'm the seller, I receive an offer, everything is fine. I sign and initial everywhere. If my agent does not deliver the executed contract back to the buyer's agent until tomorrow, the effective date is tomorrow, July 7th. This is very important. So let's go again. The effective date is the date when the last of the buyer and seller has signed or initialed the contract and delivered the final version of the contract to the other party. We'll use this hypothetical. I received the contract today. Property's on the market for 2.5 million. I received an offer for 2.1 million. I strike through the purchase price. Everything else is okay, but I strike through the purchase price. I say 2.5 million, right? I'm listed at 2.5 million for a reason. That's what I expect. So I strike through the offer at 2.1 million. I strike through, I write in 2.5 million. I initial, I sign the offer. I send it back to the buyer via my listing agent. What have I done? I have sent to the buyer a counter offer, right? I have countered your offer with 2.5 million. Everything else you said is fine, but I listed it at 2.5 million for a reason. Now you have my counter offer of 2.5 million to now accept. The method of acceptance of that $2.5 million counter offer will be to simply initial the 2.5 million and date it. Date next to your initial. If you use DocuSign or such, it's going to already date it for you. Now, what is the effective date of that contract? It's going to be the date that that buyer initials and they get that counteroffer back to me. Understand that this goes back and forth. If you continue to make changes, you do not have a fully executed contract until the last person simply signs the offer as it has been delivered to them. No changes. If they make a change, if they change the closing date, if they change the loan approval deadline, if they change the escrow deposit delivery deadline, now you have a counter offer that must be accepted. So you're going back and forth until no dates are changed. Okay? I think we got that one pretty clear. Here's a pro agent tip. Always confirm the effective date of the contract in your initial email upon delivery or receipt of the fully executed contract. Use our hypothetical. Ruth represents the buyer, sends me the offer. Ruth doesn't play any games in this market. She understands that is but whatever I listed at is what it is. If I say I want 2.5 million, I want 2.5 million, right? And so Ruth sends over an offer. Recall, in this hypothetical, I represent the seller. Here's your offer, clean, cash, 2.5 million, 14-day closing. So I receive the offer from Ruth, get it over to my seller, get them to sign that immediately, right? Today's July 6th. Send it back to Ruth. Here you go, Ruth. Congratulations. Your offer has been accepted. See you at the closing table. Let's get this money. So Ruth should say to me, awesome, Ray Cole, confirming receipt of the contract. Our effective date is July 6, 2021. See you at the closing table. Let's get this money. Someone needs to confirm the effective date because the contract, the next question I'm going to get is, where do we confirm the effective date on the contract? As of right now, there is nowhere on the contract, on the face of the contract, to confirm the effective date. So this is why the confirmation of the effective date needs to be done via email. If you have a transaction coordinator, that's generally going to be the first email that comes out. Our effective date is, escrow deposit is due, and all the other dates are outlined in that initial email. Looks similar to this. This is a purchase contract date abstract. This rolls through various deadlines in the purchase contract. So this is the first few. This is the second half. All right. And remember, you're going to get this email at the end. So we're going to take 3 minutes. I want you guys to run this hypothetical for me really quickly. Make sure we're clear on managing our timelines and our tasks and our deadlines. So the effective date of this contract, this is a FAR bar as is, so we're rolling on calendar days. The effective date of this contract is April 4, 2019. So if you're using your phones, take your calendar and roll the clock back to April 2019. And I want you to just jot down really quickly. Hopefully you're not driving. It's okay to just listen. But if you're stationary, I want you to jot down really quickly 3 dates for me based on our hypothetical contract. I want you to jot down the date that the first escrow deposit is due. Pursuant to the contract is due within 2 days. The second escrow deposit is due within 10 days. And then the loan application is due within 2 days of the effective date. Our effective date is April 4th, 2019. I'll give you 60 seconds on that. Actually, I'll give you 2 minutes. I'll give you 120 seconds. I'll give you time to grab your calendar and give you 60 seconds to jot that date down. Go ahead and be sure to participate. This is one of the differences when we taught the class in person. I was able to walk around and look at papers. So now, just take a sheet and jot those dates down. First escrow deposit due within 2 days. Second escrow deposit due within 10 days. Loan application due within 2 days. All right, really quickly, whoever is stationary, give me a couple answers for when the first escrow deposit is due in the chat. Really quickly. Due within 2 days. The first escrow deposit is due within 2 days. What does that look like? April 6th. All right. Who else got a date for me? April 6th. All right. Who else got some dates for me? We're going to go 2 more dates for the first escrow deposit. And then give me a couple dates for the second escrow deposit. All right. All right. Second escrow deposit. All right. For those that's just jumping in, remember, roll your calendars back to April 4th, 2019. And let's run these dates. All right. Guess what the answers are? First escrow deposit is due April 8th because 4/6 is a Saturday. And the second escrow deposit is due Monday, April 15th because 4/14 is a Sunday. And the loan application is due Monday, April 8th because 4/6 is a Saturday. So I dropped that at this juncture because this. In computing time periods, we got to be aware of deadlines that end on weekends and national holidays. If it ends on a weekend or national holiday, pursuant to the contract, if you lift the language directly from the contract, it says, other than time for acceptance and effective date. Only those two dates, time for acceptance and the effective date. Any time periods provided for or specified within the contract that end or occur on a Saturday, Sunday, or national legal holiday shall extend to 5 p.m. where the property is located the next business day. Yes, FAR is calendar, not business days. So let's roll it back. And this is the hardest part of our discussion. So I do this and then the rest is a piece of cake. So the contract specifically says, other than time for acceptance and the effective date, those are two deadlines that are on, well, the time for acceptance is on your, is on page 1. The effective date, the definition of it is on page 1. Outside of those two dates, any other date that ends or occurs on a weekend or national holiday rolls forward to the next business day, 5 p.m. So what does that mean? Again, going back to our hypothetical, our first escrow deposit, it ended on a Saturday. Pursuant to the contract, that has to roll forward. Our second escrow deposit ended on a Sunday. Pursuant to the contract, that has to roll forward because that is not the effective date nor the acceptance period. So for those of you who heard this talk before and you follow me on social media, you know that 4th of July is my favorite holiday. So I always use this example. All right, so I write an offer and I say that I'm the buyer and I make an offer and I put on the contract that I need to hear back from you within 2 days, right? And we'll use July 2nd. If I say I need to hear back from you, seller, within 2 days as to whether or not you accept my offer, guess what? July 4th, I need to hear from you because it says, other than time for acceptance and effective date, outside of those two dates, everything else rolls forward. I'm vegan. I don't care that you have a hot dog in one hand and a hamburger in the other. I don't care. I could do without the holiday, the meat holiday. So I need you, seller, to put the hot dog down. And if you want my offer, 2.5 million cash with a 7-day closing, or as soon as title can get it done, I need to hear back from you within 2 days. Period. That's what the contract says. Additionally, you figure out how to put the hot dog and the hamburger down. You accept my offer. You send it back. Guess what our effective date is? July 4th. Because you got it back to me. The contract specifically says that other than time for acceptance and effective date, everything else rolls forward. So what is everything else? Escrow deposit. Let's say we go into contract July 1st. And it says within 3 days, I'm making my escrow deposit. If we're open, again, and you're saying banks are open on Saturday, but it says right here that Saturday, Sunday, or national legal holiday that it rolls forward. Doesn't say anything about the banks being open, right? It says that it's a holiday. So if with 4/6 falling on a Saturday, it rolls forward to the next business day, 5 p.m. where the property is located. This is important to know because that's the other part of it. It's now 5 p.m. If you're using the deadline if it's just a regular deadline, then it's going to be what? 11:59. But if you're using this, what I call this rollover provision, you got to remember that your deadline is 4/59, not 11/59. So going back to our hypothetical, their deadline, which obviously with escrow deposit, they're making it via wire, is going to do it before 5 anyway. But let's say that was the inspection period. We would have needed to hear from the buyer by 4/59 on Monday, April 8th, if Saturday 4/6 was their deadline for inspection. Does that make sense? Any other questions on this? Victoria, if you want to come off mute, you can, just because this is an important point. And I want to make sure that you're clear. You don't have to try and spend your time typing. We're fine with you coming off mute. And anyone else, if you have any specific questions and you rather just ask it versus type it out, that's fine. Right? So just to recap, with the FAR bar as is, you're using calendar days, meaning you do not skip. Going back to Victoria, that means you do not skip Saturday and Sunday when it falls within your accounting. You count Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. You count all of those days. Versus with the CRISP, where you only count business days, Victoria, you're going to count Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Skip Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Skip Saturday, Sunday. Does that make sense? This is a very good question as well. Clarifying, do you count the day of execution? No, that's day 0. Day of execution is day 0. The next day is day 1. You have 2 days, so 1, 2. It's a good question, Mary. Thank you. All right, I hope you guys are all still my friend after that example. And I usually, like I said before, I make these examples very ridiculous, because the ridiculous you will remember. The easy you will not. If I allow those dates, and there's a reason why, I probably will bump it up now. I mean, we're a couple years out, but the reason why that hypothetical is 2019, because it works, because it gets the result that I'm looking for. It has that deadline fall on a Saturday, so it needs to roll forward. So I'll see what other dates since then have that have that same effect. But I hope you guys still love me. Inhale, exhale. We're past that. You'll never have that problem again, though, I assure you. Right? All right. So escrow deposit. So now from this point forward, we're going to talk about some of the milestones, and we're going to talk about what's important to the seller and what's important to the buyer. As it relates to the escrow deposit, what's important for the seller? We want to make sure that the escrow letter is received, because that's confirming that the escrow deposit was made. It would be the worst thing in the world for there to be a breach somewhere down the road, and you turn to your seller and say, well, don't worry about it, because there's an escrow deposit that we can go after. And title agent taps you on the shoulder and say, actually, no, they never made their escrow deposit. And you said, excuse me? So you want to make sure that you receive that letter. Now, with that being said, understand that it is not the title agent's responsibility to chase down an escrow deposit. It is only their responsibility to receive receipt and send confirmation of receipt. It is not the title agent's responsibility to chase down an escrow deposit. We'll let you know if we got it and if we don't, but we're not going, hey, buyer, your contract says that you're supposed to make that escrow deposit within 3 days. So listing agent, you want to make sure that that escrow letter is received. Now, likewise, buyer's agent, you want to make sure that you understand that missing the escrow deposit is a breach of contract, and the contract can be canceled. And if it is your second escrow deposit, your first escrow deposit is at risk of being held. Right? And then what's very, 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 very important, guys, if your clients are making, or your customers, I'm going to use the proper terminology, The buyer is making a wire, even if the seller is making a wire. Some reason the seller is bringing cash to closing. You want to ensure that the wire instructions are sent directly to the buyer or seller by the escrow agent. Do not get in the habit of taking wire instructions and sending it to your client or customer, to the buyer or seller. Here's why. You never know whose email is potentially being watched. So you want to ensure that your buyer, your seller is in the habit of always receiving wire instructions from the title agent. You'll say, and you can even have in your signature block that you'll never receive wire instructions from me. All wire instructions are to be received from the title agent. You are to call the title agent and confirm the wire instructions before making the wire. Never have yourself even be in the equation of whether or not it was your email account that was hacked. Understand that with wire instructions, it's all about preventing access to the party that's making the wire. And no one knows, because there's so many people that are involved in the transaction. There's no way of knowing whose email was hacked. Lender, TC, title, sellers, listing agent, by inspector, right? And so if you get into the habit of telling your buyer, your seller, you are only to receive wire instructions from the title agent, confirm the wire instructions with the title agent before making a wire, then at least you've done your part to keep their wire secure. All right. So that's the escrow deposit. What's the next deadline that comes up? Generally, the inspection period. Here's what's important here. You want to ensure that any agreements made regarding the inspection period are documented in writing and signed by the buyer and seller before the expiration of the inspection period. This is the buyer and the seller's contract, not the listing agent and the selling agents. Therefore, any agreement to extend the inspection period needs to be signed, needs to be in writing and executed by the buyer and the seller. Listen, email correspondence between the listing agent and the selling agent is persuasive, but it won't do if a dispute arises, all right? Again, this is the buyer and the seller's contract. Make sure you get their agreement in writing. Secondly, you want to ensure that you provide, as it relates to the inspection, have your clients decide who they're going to use for the inspection. I can't tell you, again, we do title as well as legal, how many times we have issues where buyers come back and say, the inspector missed this. There is no way that it's possible that this was not existing on the property when we close. And so you don't want it to be your one inspector referral that you sent to the buyer that they have an issue with. Because now all of a sudden, again, you're wrapped into it and they're thinking you had something to do with it. Give them a couple options, allow them to decide. Finally, if there are issues to be addressed with regards to the property, condition issues that are not minor, not cosmetic, that they're pretty significant, such that the buyer is going to want to walk if the repairs are not made just so, I suggest that you extend the inspection period to ensure that those inspections are completed pursuant to the buyer's wishes or their desires. Or alternatively, give them a credit. I've done that before. I've represented a seller and I say, hey, listen, it's best. This right now is probably going to get into aesthetics. It's best to just give a credit versus trying to chase down ensuring that these pool tiles were changed to the buyer's liking. All right. So remember that if it's a significant property condition issue, two things suggested. One, extend the inspection period to ensure that the repairs are made according to the buyer's standards, or just give a credit, right? Appraisal. Remember, we talked about the contract does not have a deadline currently for the appraisal to be completed. Consider having a deadline, listing agents. It's the worst thing to get down the road to now be having a conversation about the appraisal. Now, obviously, we're in a different market right now. Some people are paying above appraised value. Traditionally, that's not the case. And so if you want to ensure that appraisal issue is resolved ahead of time, you might want to consider having an addendum for the appraisal to be conducted by a particular date. Now, At this juncture, what will we do if the property does not appraise? Again, right now we're in a very unique situation. Right now, the property doesn't appraise. The seller says, "Oh well, somebody will pay what it, my list price, notwithstanding the appraisal." But outside of today's market, what would you do? Are we canceling the contract? Is the seller reducing the price? Is the buyer paying the difference? That's what's happening in today's market. Are we contesting the appraisal? No answer is the right answer, but it's just for you guys to have this in your arsenal to know these are options for you in the event that your property does not appraise, right? What's the next milestone? Loan approval. So in this particular scenario, what will the seller do if the initial loan approval deadline is not met? Again, we're in a different climate right now. Is the seller going to cancel the contract? Is the seller going to extend the loan approval period with a non-refundable earnest money deposit? What does that mean? That means the buyer signs an addendum saying, seller agrees to give me 5 additional days. In the event that I do not receive the loan approval within 5 days, then I'm waiving refund of my escrow deposit. Are they giving an additional deposit on top of the 5 that's already in escrow? I'm just using 5 as an example. On top of what's already in escrow, is the buyer giving an additional deposit for the additional days to obtain the loan approval? Will the seller start accepting backup offers? They're concerned now as to whether or not the buyer is going to get that loan approval, so they want to have one in the wings that they can just put in play in the event the buyer does not get their loan approval. This is what the seller is considering at this juncture. Now, if you're the buyer's agent, here's what you need to be considering at this juncture. You need to be vigilant about meeting this deadline. You cannot, you cannot miss this deadline. This is very basic. This is ABC 123 Realtor. If an extension is needed, you need to request the extension in advance and document it in a fully executed addendum. Again, this is another term where email communication is persuasive, but it is not binding. You need a signed extension. Generally, if you're extending the loan approval deadline, you're probably going to be trying to extend the closing date as well, because they kind of go hand in hand. If they need a couple more days to get the approval, they probably need a couple more days to prepare for closing as well. Again, here's what's important here. Both seller and buyer's agent, don't blow this deadline, because this is one of the last contingencies. Unless you have some other built in, this is usually one of the last contingencies, the last opportunity for the buyer to back out of the contract without risking their escrow deposit being held. Loan approval. And the last point I want to make on that is, remember, the contract used to say a commitment. It no longer says commitment, it says an approval. But you will still, in communication with the lender, generally receive a commitment. And here's what you want, buyer's agent. You want to ensure that commitment doesn't look like when they first made the application, right? If there's 10 requirements still on there, you need to be having a conversation with the lender, because that's a bit scary. Once you get closer to closing, the only thing you should be getting is, a verification of income or employment, rather, like you're still employed. And, pretty much it. Like if they're selling their property, making sure that the property sells. So just last minute things that cannot be resolved until they can be resolved, right? Verification of income, 24 hours. And sometimes at the height of COVID, it was the day of and the day after. We were not able to fund some of these transactions until the day after, because the lender wanted to ensure that buyers did not lose their job the day of closing, right? So verification of income is generally going to be one that's trailing. Again, if they're selling a property, that's going to be on there. But any of the other requirements, you want to make sure that those are resolved. Can you explain the 5 days or timeline of loan commitment from contract? So if I'm understanding your question, Kathy, that provision of the contract says that it's usually 5 days to make the loan application. And it's usually about 30 days from effective date for the loan approval. Also, a lender did not give commitment because they said PMI had to approve and needed to wait. I think, and PMI, for those who don't know, private mortgage insurance is what Kathy is referring to. Whatever the case might be, that's a good question, Kathy. Thanks for asking it. Here's the deal. Whatever the case might be for why the loan approval is not given at the date, the deadline that's stated in the contract, whatever the reason may be, if you don't have a clear loan approval, you need to be having a conversation about an extension. And just have a very direct conversation with the lender if you're concerned about being able to get that extension, and include the buyer, because at the end of the day, this is their money on the line, and say, okay, I'm going to use your example, this PMI thing. What's the likelihood of it not being approved? Is this a what do you call it? Is this a normal course of action? Or is this something we need to be concerned about such that we need to get an extension to ensure that we get it, right? If this is something that's yeah, and that can't happen. Kathy said she had to extend several days, first time we've ever had it happen. I can tell you right now, we get files pretty often that have a lot of extensions, and it happens. And so here's the deal. Every extension that you need, Kathy, you need to document it. You must get a signed addendum with the extension. And again, in today's market, if you're getting to a point where the seller is frustrated or otherwise not agreeing to just give you an extension just on the basis of the addendum, meaning they're not looking for an additional escrow deposit, or they're not looking for the escrow deposit to be non-refundable, you need to have a direct conversation with your buyer. For example, pre-COVID, had a buyer was, they were not cookie cutter. It was not a cookie cutter loan. We knew that from the outset. And so getting down to closing, literally had to get an extension 3 times on the loan approval. And of course, that conversation got tighter and tighter every time it was had. And so at the last extension, a direct conversation was had with the buyer to say, hey, listen, we're going to send over this addendum requesting an extension. If they do not agree, you're going to see the next correspondence you're going to see from us is a release and cancellation, because we don't want you to lose your $10,000 escrow deposit. Ultimately, it's your decision. Just because the buyer does not get the loan approval, you guys do know that just because the buyer does not get the loan approval by the deadline, it does not mean that the contract is canceled. There are other options if you look into the contract of how to proceed. The seller can assume that you waived your contingency and they're just going to wait and see. They're just going to wait and see if you can meet your closing date. And if you don't, that's on you. They don't have to call you and say, hey, did you get your approval, right? It's up to the buyer and the buyer's agent to be proactive about getting that and making sure that the buyer's escrow deposit is covered. All right. All right. Association approval. Note the deadline to make that application. You guys should know, even outside of COVID, sometimes there's associations that are only open on the 3rd Tuesday of each month from 11 to 1:45, right? And if you were talking about having a quick closing and you missed that third Tuesday, it's going to be a problem. And so you want to make sure that that application is made immediately, because sometimes it can take longer than anticipated. You want to ensure once you get the estoppel back from the title agent that you review it to make sure that you know the requirements of the association. There may be a interview required. You don't want to get down to closing and say, oof, the buyer didn't schedule their association approval interview. So make sure you follow up with that. And then finally, with that approval, the buyer may get a hard copy of their approval that the title agent needs to record. So make sure that your buyer makes sure to hold on to that and get it over to the title agent. The buyer will be notified. They should be notified by the title agent whether a hard copy of that approval is needed for recording. Survey, coming around the bend. Pre-COVID, surveys could get done pretty quickly. And so because this is a cost that's borne by the buyer, we used to suggest that You make sure that the survey is not ordered until after the inspection period. Now, again, because of the market and things are going pretty, everything related to the closing process is kind of backlogged. You can order a survey now and it'll come in probably just in time, right? So you don't necessarily have to wait until after the inspection period. But in any event, the reason why you were waiting until after the inspection period, again, is because you didn't want the buyer to incur any unnecessary costs specifically for that survey. And then the buyer in a cash transaction, guys, know this, they can waive the survey. In a finance transaction, a lender generally is not. They are not waiving a survey. But in a cash transaction, the buyer can. Finally, the title commitment. As I mentioned earlier, failure to deliver the title commitment to the buyer is technically a breach of the contract. You generally don't have this issue, but just know that the seller does have an obligation pursuant to the contract to deliver the title commitment to the buyer within X number of days. There's actually even a blank for that. But I have not had anyone have an issue with that. Again, just know that that is a requirement. I would suggest that you as the agent, whether you're the buyer's agent or the seller's agent, review the title commitment when it's sent out by the title agent to acquaint yourself with title matters that the title agent will be working on to resolve. One thing I always say is the worst thing, say for example, usually the most contentious ones are if the seller was previously divorced and the title agent must ask for the divorce settlement decree. It's like pulling a Band-Aid off a scab. It's like, why are they asking me for this? And so if you're aware of that when they call you and fuss about it, you'll already know and you'll be able to kind of soothe it over because you're the agent, right? You know everything. they think you guys know absolutely everything. And so it doesn't hurt for you to make yourself aware that, oof, I see them asking for the divorce decree. If my phone rings, this is probably what they're going to be, my seller's going to be calling me about, right? The next hot button issue is the lien search and the permit search. You know that you should know now, especially if you've taken a contract class with us before, that open permits are not title issues. So the seller is not obligated to close out open permits unless you have additional language. You have a language in the additional term section that the seller will close out all open permits at their expense prior to closing. Ruth is saying, wouldn't the buyer get the title commitment? I work in Broward, Miami. I know it's different in Palm Beach County. So the buyer does have the obligation to, well, the buyer selects a title agent. Within that contract, it still says that the seller will ensure that the title commitment is delivered because it does not say that the title agent will. So obviously, that's a good question, Ruthie. That's a good question because what would happen in your particular case? Let's say, for example, the title agent neglects to get the title commitment over to the buyer within X number of days. Although not binding, it is persuasive to say, well, that's the title agent that you selected and they were slow in getting you the title commitment. But pursuant to the contract does not say, seller, you must get the title commitment to the buyer within X number of days if you selected the title agent. Does that make sense? It says that the title commitment needs to get there. It's contracts. All right. So again, wrapping up the slide that we have on the screen. If you represent the buyer, you want to consider adding language to the additional terms section that the seller will be responsible for closing out all open permits prior to closing at their expense. If you represent the seller, you have no idea what they're talking about. I'm just kidding. No, you do want to deliver clear title. But again, open permits are not title issues. Just know that. So if you don't include that language and an open permit is reflected on the lien search, the title agent will let you know that they're not going to hold up closing for an open permit to be closed out. Code violations? Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. Finally, the final walkthrough. Okay, I'm going to assume that everyone is doing their final walkthrough. I'm going to assume that everyone is conducting their final walkthrough to ensure that the property is in the expected condition. You want to ensure that everything that was supposed to be left in the property, light fixtures, appliances, etc. You want to make sure that that's there. You want to make sure there are no holes in the walls, right? You want to make sure that the property is in the same condition that it was in when you went under contract because that's what the contract provides for. Janet says that the appraisal comes too low and the seller comes in low and the seller and buyer do not agree to essentially lower the price, can the buyer pull out and get his escrow back? Okay, so that's a good question. Two things. Generally, you guys know that we have a rider for appraisal. We have an appraisal rider that specifically says that if the property does not appraise at X number of dollars, the buyer will cancel the contract and get their escrow deposit back. There's a rider specifically for that. The contract does not specifically state that. What customarily happens is parties assume that if the property does not appraise, and this is on a finance transaction, that if the property doesn't appraise, that the buyer's not going to get financing, and therefore the contract will be canceled based on the financing contingency. That's customary, but that's not always safe. Because what if, unbeknownst to you, your lender sends out a loan approval based on the appraised value? Does that make sense? So pre-COVID, I've had buyer's agent that literally they included an appraisal contingency rider with every contract. I don't think that's going to fly in today's market, but to answer your question, can the buyer get their escrow deposit back? Yes, but those are the conditions. Generally, you're not going to have, like I said, customarily 98% of the time, just based on the financing contingency. If it's a finance transaction, the buyer's going to be able to cancel just based on the financing contingency. Property doesn't appraise, buyer can't get financing, buyer cancels the contract because the proceeding with the contract was contingent upon financing. If it's a cash transaction, you for sure should have the appraisal contingency rider attached because there is no financing contingency. You're paying cash. What happens if the lender waives the appraisal? The buyer's putting down almost 50%. The lender said the appraisal. Oh. Then you can't, if the lender waives the appraisal, which I want to know who this lender is, but if the lender waives the appraisal, then you have no grounds to say that the appraisal came in low because there is no appraisal. If the buyer still wants an appraisal, the buyer can absolutely order an appraisal. 100%. The lender is just saying that their agreement with the buyer is that their financing is not contingent on the appraisal. However, the buyer can absolutely order their own appraisal and make the contract contingent upon the appraised value of the property. All right. All right. Finally, closing day. You want to advise the clients not to schedule any vacations immediately before or after closing date, the scheduled closing date, because things can happen. Things can always happen. We talked about last week on Ron, if you have a seller, they can sign early some documents, some other documents may be signed later. But generally, you want to make sure that your clients keep that day open because anything can happen, right? Specifically for buyers, I advise buyers to either take the day off or schedule at least 4 hours for closing. This is not a lunch break meeting, right? Tell your buyers this is not a lunch break meeting because it's going to take much longer than what their lunch break will allow for. You guys are probably familiar with the funding approval process. That is after the buyers have signed, their documents are sent to the lender for the lender to review the documents and confirm that the title agent can release the funds. That's what funding approval is called. Sometimes they go quick, sometimes they go slow. It is completely out of the party's control. It's all up to the lender. So to remove any angst or confusion or frustration, just have your buyers take the day off, or again, at least schedule at least 4 hours for closing. Finally, you want to make sure that the buyers wire their cash to close well before the scheduled closing time. If you get any inkling that your buyer is using a credit union, an online savings account, etc., or anything outside of a traditional Bank of America, Chase, national institution to make their wire, they definitely want to do that as soon as possible. Credit union wires, they go through at least 2 additional steps before they hit the title agent's account. Sometimes those wires can come through the next day. So if you don't want it to be one of those situations where you're saying, we didn't get funds, we're not funded, make sure that the wire is made in advance, right? Now, the last thing is you want to make sure that you confirm the progress of the transaction. Consider using a transaction coordinator. If you're a top producing agent, plan to be a top producing agent, your time is best spent after you get all this under control, you understand it yourself. Again, this is not, you're not getting a transaction coordinator for the purposes of just kicking the contract to them and let them figure it out. Let them put, let them be entirely responsible for this process, but it's for them to handle the administrative process of it, the administrative tasks. You know what needs to happen. You're watching it, but you're not the ones that's communicating with the buyer or the seller to make sure that the information request is completed. Does that make sense? You're not the one communicating with the parties to make sure that this document from the title agent is signed. Your focus should be on getting listings and getting properties under contract. Transaction coordinators are extremely helpful in assisting with managing timelines, processing documents, and delivery of information to parties. Questions? You're welcome, Janet. We went through that really quickly. Hope it's giving you guys, again, an understanding of the full scope of the transaction, the contract to close process. From going under contract, knowing what your effective date is, knowing what calendar days versus business days, which measure you're using, knowing when your deadlines fall. Remember, other than the time for acceptance and the effective date, all other dates, if they end or occur on a Saturday, Sunday, or national holiday, they roll to the next day. Yes, you guys are going to get an email with that timeline from the slide earlier. You're going to get that as an attachment. You're welcome. I'm glad that you guys found that helpful. Again, our corporate office is in downtown West Palm. We have offices strategically located throughout South Florida and North Florida up to Port St. Lucie. So we close all of Florida, Kathy. We close all of Florida. So we close locally. We even close in some of the brokerage's offices. You're welcome. Now that everyone's back open, we close in brokerage offices as well. So thanks, Oscar. Thank you so much for attending. Again, you guys, if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to reach out to me. We'll see you guys next week. Same place, same time.